some time ago, I was reading again the speech in accepting the Adorno Prize by Judith Butler. Judith Butler received the Adorno Prize last year in September. There was quite a controversy about her. But while I was reading her speech again, accepting the Adorno Prize in Frankfurt, I thought something special happened during that event and during this talk, and it could be useful also to quickly mention it for me to give a conceptual framework for interpreting my real topic, foreign policy of war and American democracy, in a talk. And also, which was probably, hasn't been noticed really, at least I don't see it in the literature, a reflection on it, can say there was an interesting first-time dialogue between the school, in the way she represents Judith Butler, as a school of post-structural theorizing, reflecting the famous French-American talk, post-structural feminist debate, which was very influential in both countries, especially in the 80s and the 90s. And Judith Butler, with her approach, responds to the Frankfurt School with the prize she was awarded, the Frankfurt approach. And she raises the famous question Adorno raised in his Minima Moralia, a book published in the 60s, and another one, Reflections on Morality, which was published as late as 2010 in the United States in English. Okay, the famous question was, is there a good life in the false one? In German, gibt es ein gutes Leben im Falschen? Famous question Adorno raised there. And Judith Butler, in her acceptance talk, the award, reflects on that for many pages and so forth. I will just mention it here and mention why I'm interested, why it's important. What is for me so important in response to Adorno in this more pessimistic kind of Hegelian negative totality thinking, and she reads one quote from Minima Moralia, where Adorno says, given our negative totality, our world, the sad moral affairs in which we're living in, this would lead probably everybody almost to protest. And so she emphasizes on the word almost to protest. Adorno thinks one should always rise to protest. And she says almost is probably too thin. Adorno has emphasized, and she thinks one should probably do more. She says the physical presence of the body in the streets should be there, should be done, should be organized. The physical protest. Whereas Adorno retreats a little bit and thinks in his whole approach, the negative totality is so strong in our modern world that you cannot do very much really in real protest, in physical protest. The body in the streets doesn't change anymore. On the contrary, you have testimonies to students. If you go about and protest, you bring the state bureaucracy into the university, which we have today observed, probably. The bureaucratization in university life is enormous in contrast to Adorno's time in the 60s. So we have here in this kind of approach the tension between, is it worthwhile? Does it achieve something when you protest? And Adorno says almost, maybe not. And he resigns or stays and recommends to stay in the fear of, you have a vision of a better world, but you know you cannot achieve it. So that you have to maintain the tension, a sad kind of tension in you of, we can have a better world, but we cannot achieve it, at least not in our present time, not in the near future. When Judith Butler, with a post-structuralist approach, thinks you can, if you want to, if you do it in the right way. Okay, with this kind of two kind of approaches, I would like to come then now to some real statements, not only deconstructivist, but also some real statements of American foreign policy, war, and also a little bit of my personal experience in the United States, reflecting on that. In 1971, when I was a doctoral student at the University of Minnesota, we had a graduate seminar on Plato. There was a big sensation during that one session of seminar, Plato seminar, when somebody introduced a paper that was leaked from the Pentagon. There was research done during the Vietnam War. Why are we American military people are not so successful in combat as we should be, given our military equipment and so forth? And so there was an internal paper done by the Pentagon, which was leaked, was not supposed to be public, about the Korean War. And the conclusion of the paper was, the Pentagon paper was, not a civilian institution, was why the American military had so many difficulties in the Korean War two-thirds of all soldiers could not shoot. There's an enormous amount of people there. And then while we did some further research, we found a book that was completely forgotten about by a General Marshall, not the famous Marshall, another Marshall, who published a book in 1947 about the experience in World War II. And he came to the same conclusion. The American soldiers, even in World War II, could not shoot. Two-thirds of them. And so elite units always were the ones who rescued something when there was a military problem there. And his conclusion of this General Marshall, not the famous one again, his conclusion was that the American socialization of children, of youth, the American family, civilian institutions, so forth, were so strong that when they were later drafted into the army, they could not shoot, and they were less afraid of being killed, they were more afraid of killing, given the strong moral kind of education, moral standard. I think it's a wonderful statement about American society, actually. For a military person, it's a terrible thing, of course, but it's I think that's a little known fact and forgotten about it. And when I was still in the United States, I published a little bit about that in a journal here in Germany, but it was never really picked up and nobody really paid any attention to that. I think it's very interesting statements you can make and draw upon all kinds of philosophies and theories and so forth. And also keep in mind, can you change the world or can you not change the world, given that attitude? In 1971 also became known, that was the height of the Vietnam War protest. At that time, of course, that statement that was introduced in the Vietnam War. It was that a very provocative statement. We just saw it posted around the United States. Today it's, what's so provocative about that? I remember that when I was a graduate student. Carried strong emotions, counter and pro emotions. Okay, in 1971, it became known that the Pentagon was investigating at the time 185 criminal acts of violence in the Army of Vietnam. So what was the background of that? Was the Army was in 1971-72 was in decay in Vietnam. That was a real background, for me at least, why the political leadership, President Nixon, decided to steer a course of kind of truce with North Vietnam and to withdraw the army. The story goes, in many cases, that a lieutenant, when he couldn't order the soldiers anymore into combat, he had to argue with them and say, well, soldiers, look, we have to tomorrow, once in a while, you have to do some combat, so we had to do some arguing and so on. If it was a lieutenant didn't understand that, he says, order them. Tomorrow you're going to go in combat. And one of the other words about that. During the night, some soldier threw a hand grenade into his tent. So there was no further combat anymore for that platoon. And so the Pentagon thought in 185 cases they could bring these people into court and to go against them. 185 cases means there were many, many more. So you could never prove anything, but in 185. So that was the state of affair among the American military. These were draft people, not volunteer. Today we have a voluntary army. These were draft people. Were drafted normal kids were drafted into the army, and they were in protest. And in 1973, I came to Frankfurt to be at the Peace Research Institute for 5 years, and I was in touch there with these young soldiers. The last generation of being drafted still before the army was switched over to a voluntary army. And they were kind of interesting, very nice kids and so on. And then at that time also I went to a concert at the famous Jahrhunderthalle Höchst, Frankfurt, and there was Cat Stevens who gave a concert there. Cat Stevens has, by the way, returned. He became a convert became a Muslim, lived in London, has returned to the United States. It's Cat Stevens again, has taken his old name on again. And like many American singers, sometimes have a religious conversion, but they return again later. So he's back. And that time, in '72, he has written a song in support of McGovern's presidential campaign, Peace Train, famous song. I don't know if you've ever heard of the song. It was very popular. Peace Train. Come Home America was the theme of the song, and McGovern's theme was also Come Home America. Let's go back, let's withdraw from Vietnam and come home. And Cat Stevens gave his concert. About 50% of the audience were these young American GIs. And and the song didn't come. And so he concluded his concert, Cat Stevens. But then encore was, of course, shoot to return. And so then the soldiers started to clap, of course. Peace train. They wanted to have an enormous emotion when they hear that song. And then Cat Stevens came back and to the enormous emotions, was singing the song Peace Train. It was quite an emotional moment there. When you see the audience of American soldiers want to hear the song Peace Train with deep emotions on the mouth. So that's some interesting facts or observations about the main topic was supposed to talk here, foreign policy, war, and American democracy. And so the times have become different, of course. The political leadership has decided under Nixon that time, okay, a draft army is not the future of the United States, so from then on we have a voluntary army now. So these kind of issues I discussed about are not typical anymore, are not to be so observant anymore. Now, another element, of course, is in this and if protest is important and protest is meaningful, again, I remind you of debate, just indirect debate alluded to at the beginning between Judith Butler and Adorno. And is protest meaningful or not meaningful? Is our reality such a totality that you cannot change very much, or can you change something? I would say the Korean War would not have ended as early by Eisenhower if it hadn't been for those kind of soldiers who didn't shoot. And the Vietnam War really ended also earlier than because of this kind of protest I mentioned. Well, there was a violent protest. In the United States, of course, there was mass street demonstrations, non-violent protests that helped to bring the war to an end as early as 1973 when the truce was signed between the United States and North Vietnam. However, there's also some other kind of protest possible, maybe on the elite level. Is it possible with intellectual honesty, maybe? Not a question of real street protest or some other kind of violent protest or non-violent protest to shape the events, but is it also, can we apply the concept of intellectual honesty, sincerity, maybe to influence events? And here I would like briefly make a few remarks about 9/11. I don't want to discuss 9/11 itself, we know all about it, but some personal observations about it, why I employ the concept of intellectual sincerity and honesty about it. What happened in 9/11, I think, was not greatly observed and not really known all that much and discussed about and written about is what happened in 9/11 was that Colin Powell, after 9/11, after the attacks, Colin Powell was the first person who made a public statement defining what happened at 9/11. Everyone was wondering, what was it? How do you have to think about that? How do you classify it? Whatever, what kind of framework do you put it? And he was the first one who made a public statement and called it acts of war. That was, why is it so important that they use this formulation, acts of war? Well, it means that you put the event of 9/11 on the, if you want to talk in strategic terminology, that 9/11 was on the strategic level. Strategic level meant after the end of the Cold War, with the disappearance of the Soviet Union as a countervailing power to the United States, the bipolarity is gone. Would there be something else coming up? And most people who considered 9/11 on the strategic level defined it as the coming new bipolarity for the United States. There's no challenge. It's not the Soviet Union anymore. There was a time in between. Now it's a terror, war on terror was defined later. So Powell was the first one to formulate it that way and framed the discussion. Could we have framed it otherwise? That's an interesting question here. Or was it the only way to think about that? It's the only way. So obvious maybe, so clarity. We didn't have to discuss it. Well, there was on another level, the question was, if you think in strategic terminology, could be framed, be put on the tactical level. Was there anybody who thought about that? did anybody agree to think about it that way or challenge the notion of acts of war? Tactical level meant it was on a police level. Acts of war meant to use the military. Tactical means you use policemen, allied governments who are friendly with you, CIA, whatever it is, agencies and so forth. That was what you put on a tactical level. And I was at that time, happened to be in the United States. I was on vacation in Santa Fe. A friend of us gave us a house, an old adobe house there, a wonderful place. And we were surprised there, my wife and I, and had to stay there for another week because we couldn't fly back with all the airlines at that time. So I could observe what was going on, and I say it's much better on site. In all the Washington debates and discussions, two people stood out, Brzezinski and former NATO ambassador Robert Hunter, Clinton's NATO ambassador, whom I knew personally quite well. And both argued for it. It's not it's a tactical level. It's a very different concept. And Brzezinski gave it some weight. He also said we have been too hard in our foreign policy. We have to be more softer. So that was, but after a week, Hunter and Brzezinski didn't repeat it anymore. They were drowned out. Became dangerous of being maybe not quite patriotic. So the school of it's a war, it's a strategic issue, was drowning out the others and pushing to the sidelines. So nobody after a week dared to continue that debate. I thought it was a loss of intellectual sincerity and cowardness, actually, intellectual cowardness for some people to shy away from this debate. I'll come back to that later for a moment. Let me tell a little bit more personally about intellectual honesty. While in Santa Fe, in this adobe house from a friend of us, under historic monument, they had no washing machine. So after a week we had to go, when the vacation was over, we had another week there. We went to one of the public laundromats to get our laundry cleaned. And as you all know, the United States laundry, the American laundromat, a special place. You don't meet there normal people, you meet some special people there. So while I was doing technical stuff, there was a machine there. I knew more than my wife how to get it going. American technology on laundromats and so forth. My wife was outside and talked to some people there. There was one lady whose father had been a soldier in Germany, stationed there, so she knew a little bit Europe, and so was not the kind of provincial person you think about, Mexico and so forth, and some others. And they all said unisono, we are to blame, we the United States. When it came to machines for washing, came out there and heard my wife talking to them and said, we are all to blame for it, for these attacks of 9/11. I said, my God, something's going on. And so then I bought every day afterwards, the New Mexican newspapers, Albuquerque Tribune, I think someone was New Mexican, and I looked at what did the editor decide, what kind of letters to the editor would they publish. So I would say 25 to 30% of the list editor had this theme, articulated that. We are to blame. We Americans are responsible for that. Not we Americans, but our foreign policy is to blame for that. So there was a readiness there, an element in the United States, I would say, if you generalize that, to go into debate about that. And so, but the debate was closed in Washington very, very quickly, very fastly on, it's a strategic issue. It's not the tactic, we couldn't talk about it anymore. And later I asked some people in Washington, when I was back in Germany, I asked Americans who came from Washington, I told them about it, that's just what I'm telling you. What do you make of that? Am I not quite right in my observations? Said, no, that's good observation, probably quite right. But that's New Mexico, And especially later after the anthrax attacks, nobody would dare anymore to say anything about that. So there was a loss of closed minds, loss of intellectual sincerity, and no interest in anybody to talk about. And the consequence, we all know about that. Even today we suffer from that. It's a sad story, actually. It's not with intellectual honesty, intellectual debate, with tremendous negative consequences. We all know about it, and we can talk lots about that. But I would like to continue on this issue a little bit further. How did Europe react to that? Was there maybe some more insight or intellectual honesty or something? And as we all know, we should not forget, all European countries initially supported George Bush's plan to go to war with Iraq. Afghanistan was a different matter. And even Germany, Schröder thought he would bring Germany by making an alliance with George Bush on war and terror, by bringing Germany up to international level, which is not understood here in Germany. Forgotten about that. We all think Schröder was a peace chancellor, wasn't it? And he was, on the contrary. We broke later away from the promise, and we all know about that. Okay, that's the European nation states. But on the EU level, if you go all through EU documents on foreign policy issues, on these issues I'm talking about right now, you never see the European on foreign policy documents ever the war on terror came up as a word, as a wording. I know that because I didn't have the time, but an American friend of mine, a professor at Wiener Campbell, went through the enormous energy. She sifted through all the EU documents issued at that time on foreign policy and on the issue of terror and so forth. And there was never did the European Union use the term war on terror or war on terrorism or worldwide war on terror, or global war on terrorism. So in the EU level, had different thinking apparently. So it was possible. And I know from inside, from Bush administration, there was great anger about the European Union about that. But it was never publicly articulated and so forth. Okay, how did that continue? In 2007, the eminent British arms control strategic thinker, if you're in foreign policy issues, security policy issues, you must know the name Sir Lawrence Friedman. Highly revered by left and right because they always make statements. The left can somebody pick up, the right can somebody pick up, and so on. In 2007 he gave the Sir Alison Buchanan Memorial Lecture. And that's a very honorable thing for him. He was an elderly gentleman. And in 1977, there was another statesman who gave, it's also September, when the new political year starts in the Anglo-Saxon world, also in Great Britain. Helmut Schmidt that time gave the memorial lecture. His lecture that time is most credited to be the intellectual starting point of what we later called in German the Nachrüstung. So there's great attention there. This every fall, this lecture. Okay, so Lawrence Friedman reflected on 9/11. He reflected upon what I just said. And he used his terminology I just laid out. Very few people did, but he did. Used the term of strategic and tactical. And he said it was an issue on tactical war. And he said very emotionally, we should have never fought the war on the 9/11. And he said it was great regret and so on. And he condemned it, really, and also reflected upon the negative strategic, poor strategic thinking that was going on that time. So this, you cannot say easily what could have happened if and so on, but we can learn the lesson that you can be insistent on that. And later on you could be victorious. And so you can be maybe a Lawrence Friedman saying we should have never, if you had thought it through, thought it correctly, should have never thought this war. It's Iraq, for example. And putting the whole thing on a strategic level, looking at it as a strategic challenge to the Western world, to the United States. In the United States, the support could continue because most Americans believe that Saddam Hussein was involved, indirectly or directly. The propaganda was out on that, or no, it's wrong. And in 2006, a new American, younger, as the sociologists put it, cohort grew up. And so finally, starting 2006, in articles like, in newspapers like, in journals like Dissent, you could read the first analysis on public opinion, which were not so made public. And so, but it led to the election of Obama in 2008. And so a kind of new generation seemed to be coming up with different views and different thinking about this whole issue. And Obama seemed to be one of them. Because in 2009, in his famous lecture, he had promised he wanted to do that. He went to Cairo, carefully prepared park in Cairo in 2009 in July, when he wanted to put the American relationship with the Arab world on a new footage. And essentially what he said there was, all conflicts in the Middle East are political. Enormous reformulation. They're not unsolvable. That means if they're political, then all that was the significance of his talk. And if they're all political, they can be solved. You don't have to employ military means to solve it. If they're political of nature, they can be discussed about and they can be solved. With one exception, he said in his speech, that was Al Qaeda. He didn't think that was a political solution to Al Qaeda. That need to be fought. So it was that way. He justified already the war in Afghanistan. We continue the war in Afghanistan. And I remember when if you have a chance, go into YouTube or whitehouse.gov, you will find this, you can see his talk there. Very interesting because of one enormous compassion he generated by going there. And at one point during his talk, and most people that understood what he was saying, the audience, a huge audience there at the university in Cairo, when you had between a paragraph, a short break, somebody called out and said, Barack Obama, we all love you. And all enormous applause. And Barack said, thank you. Then he continued. It's difficult to believe that when you hear that, when you think today about the reputation U.S. foreign policy has in the Middle East. But that time there was a great chance of a renewal. And if you keep that in mind, you understand also why he got the Nobel Prize. Because the hope was, yes, he could probably deliver and so on. It's another tragedy. We don't have to analyze why that didn't work out. Okay, I think I gave my answers. My factual statements. I wanted to make not deconstructive statements, but factual statements about why I think, or we can also debate about it, or try to answer the initial question, the indirect or open debate. Judith Butler responding to Adorno's statement, is there a good life, almost as an Aristotelian formulation, but I don't know how to put it better, is there a good life and the false one, and the wrong one? And how could it be possibly not achieved, but how can we approach it perhaps? One maybe is we see how a good socialization, good values with the American soldiers in World War II and in the Korean War, how important then can be the right values, the right socialization that can lead at least to resistance to something which is maybe what Adorno would call negative totality in his Hegelian tradition. And maybe can we achieve something more with intellectual sincerity and intellectual passion, and that maybe Judith Butler had in mind. We can do more than just being pessimistic about the future. You can do more. You can, with the bodies in the streets, as she put it in her article, always some further protest that goes beyond the pessimism of Adorno and the critical theory, the later critical theory. Adorno was one of them. And maybe to be that way, maybe it could be a kind of paradoxical thing, could be the most realistic thing to do. You know, we have in international relations, we have this theory of neoliberalism and of neorealism. And neorealism is mostly what we consider to be the hardcore people, the people who advocate mostly that conflict is inevitable, has always been around, is a kind of anthropological and pessimistic about that is impossible in international life to be without conflict, always will be and has been and will always in different new forms will show up there. These are usually called the realist or the theory of rewritten in the 1970s, reformulated by Walters and others, call themselves a neo-realist against the so-called sometimes utopian neoliberals who hold out the hope that we can do something to prevent wars. But maybe, ironically speaking, maybe what I just talked about that could be the most realistic, in its positive sense, more realistic kind of approach in thinking about it. Okay, my 30 minutes are up, so I'm here now. Thank you.
Thank you you very much for this very interesting input. I think there's many points that we could discuss now. So hopefully some of you have some questions, because we have some time to have a discussion now. So if you have any questions,
challenges,
yeah, or any comments, remarks,
counter statements.
Professor Kappa.
Thank you very much for your talk. I'm a cultural historian and a cultural theorist, and I was just struck how differently I would approach the whole subject about American attitudes to war, because I was, like, while you talked, I was wondering whether the question of whether America engages in wars, and perhaps even engages foolishly in wars, as it happened in Iraq, is up to, or could be up to, a very militaristic tradition in the United States, and a mentality that's different from a European mentality. So I was more thinking along those lines, while you were more arguing about intellectuals and leaders' strategic interests and tactical interests, and my view why the Bush administration, for example, could succeed is more about a sort of fascination for anything military in America, fascination for war, a strange, paradoxical relationship between individualism and individual self-reliance on the one hand, but also an almost masochistic desire for subservience and leaders on the other side. I was wondering what you think about that difference in approach.
I think to make a dramatic statement is, you're covering this tradition. I try to characterize a little bit. It almost does violence to Adorno thinking, to summarize in such a brief statement and so on. But I tried to make a little bit of statement because of little facts, little known. Also my experience in the United States I've made there when I lived there for 4 years and so forth, and came back. I was teaching last year and the year before again there. Is that, of course, you can't read American mentality, American cultural mentality the way you do, and a lot of Americans who do that themselves. I found then, with examples I gave there, not about the Iraq War and so forth, I gave these examples about that American, why is it really surprising fact, why doesn't anybody know about it? Why is that known, that American soldiers, 2/3 of them didn't want to be soldier, and couldn't kill. That's quite an optimistic statement, actually. And the surprising thing is, and I have encountered these things very much in the United States. I came to the United States, if I want to be polemical, as a pessimistic German. I left as an optimistic. It's enormous, the positive tradition I have encountered in the United States, and this is examples. I think that's quite, you will not find it in any other country. If the explanation the General Marshall in his book from 1947 gave is an interesting one, could well be, we don't know, but because of American socialization, peaceful socialization values, a normal American kid could not be a good soldier in the sense of killing and so forth. So I would say. I wanted to give this example, not to rewrite American cultural history or be smart on that, but just to give only as an example. It is possible to do something. People are ready to do something if they can articulate themselves and do something. This was kind of what the American soldiers did. Had an enormous impact, especially in Korean War and so forth. We don't have these figures about the Vietnam War. So why people shoot or couldn't shoot, so we don't know anything about that. There was no investigation was made. I have only this kind of what I mentioned, this kind of when soldiers who were hand grenades into the tent of their lieutenant. But that was not this kind of, what we have before, something else. So these are examples that things can be, destiny can be changed, or the negative totality is not so of such a totality as Adorno puts it. All I see is point. I see his point when you warn the students and says, don't be so absurd in your optimism. You can think you can change the world in the 60s or the 70s. The totality of the state is so of totality, you will lose the autonomy of the university. Now, you have to judge now yourself. Is the university still autonomous as it was in the 60s and 70s? I think at that point he was right. Okay, and a little remark again about, I could also put it in another language. I put it in strategic language, tactical and strategic. By that I meant only, is it a matter of war or is it a matter of police? Who's responsible for that? What kind of challenge is it? How dangerous is it really? But who decides that? It was a brief debate. Could have also gone somewhere else. And eminent people have argued that way. Lawrence Friedman in hindsight, and then Brzezinski and so forth. So I didn't want to rewrite cultural history. But the question is, why didn't Brzezinski succeed under Ambassador Hunter? Maybe your answer is that one, a possible answer. Because of a tradition on the American right of war as heroic kind of thing. So you hear often from the American right, when I was lately in the United States, discussions like, why aren't the Germans really, coming along with us in war making? Aren't they? Did they lose their instinct? Their killer instinct or something? That would testify more to what you're kind of. Okay, I'll leave it at that with my response. I didn't want to create a cultural theory. I just want to say this. I'm sorry. I just want to make this little kind of interesting point. Okay.
Tino?
Oh, that was a long time ago. But I can jump in here. Well, there's this anarchist from way back called Alex Berkman with a K, where he said in an essay called "The Thing is the Idea," or "The Idea is the Thing," maybe. That revolution is evolution at its boiling point. So it's like a kettle of water. You can't make it boil at any time. You have to wait until it's there at that certain point. And obviously there are powers there that do not want it to reach that point. And coincidentally, your talk pretty much corresponds with my presentation. So,
Sorry.
No, that's fine. You didn't take anything away from me. But at those critical times, as in 69, 72 Vietnam protests, what we see is, and you mentioned, okay, we have to change it from the lottery to from draft to voluntary army. Okay, so mechanisms are being put in place to control population reaching that boiling point. So when you ask how come critical voices or intellectual dissent after 9/11, there weren't any or as many, I'm not quite sure, because critical voices, they were there, a dime a dozen pretty much. Across the spectrum. Of course, you would never find them in the Washington Post or New York Times, but Chris Hedges, Noam Chomsky, comedians like Bill Maher, and they do speak out. Susan Sontag spoke out. Journalists locally, but usually it doesn't take. Phil Donahue on MSNBC, the shows get cancelled. That's what happened in the run-up to Iraq, at least. So that's another control mechanism, of course, from yeah, people, the thing is the idea needs to change. Maybe this war isn't a good idea, maybe it's not a tactic or a strategy, maybe it's something else. So people can't hear it if there are forces stopping people from hearing others challenge the dominant idea, then that boiling point will not be reached, at least not as fast.
That's right, yeah. Cannot violently disagree or something. Good. But there can also be lots of okay, the power structure was the way so that the minority voices could not become a majority voice on 9/11. That's of course, yes. But there are points where you could imagine things could have gone differently. The Democrats, I know it from friends in Washington, deeply involved in democratic politics at the time. The Democrats had a debate in the leadership in 2002. They had it again in 2004. Where should we position ourselves during the election? And it was the conservative wing of the Democrats. Roughly speaking, you have 1/3 left, center, and right, and so on. And normally, center and right Democrats make the decision within the party, and they both decided in 2002, 2004, we will not go into the opposition against Bush on 9/11 and the war and the decision to go to war. Because then they have a feeling like the Social Democrats in Germany sometimes have, we are Vaterlandslose Gesellen, as the American equivalent, deep in their bones and so forth, and so they decided, they were afraid of that, of this countercharge, of being, being unpatriotic Americans or something like that. And so they didn't challenge that. In 2004 too, Kerry at that time said they would have conducted the war better, more efficiently. The anti-war hero he was in the early 70s when he was
one of the veterans that threw away the medal.
He was one of the great organizers of anti-war demonstrations in Washington at that time. And so that was and so those opposition people in the United States maybe could have been unfold themselves, had no chance, no platform to unfold. Really. And so it was a conscious debate there within the Democratic Party leadership about that, how to go about it. And it only changed much later with Obama. We called the dumb war, as a young senator in Illinois, it was gained credibility and so forth. It could have been, with Democrats would have had an honest track record, and they could have probably succeeded possibly much earlier if they had maybe. We don't know. Since they didn't try it, we don't know. We can just, speculate about it. What's interesting also, I remind again, we should not feel superior as Europeans, as Germans in the United States, because the German government was supporting Bush.
Until election came closer in 2002, or?
Well, the Democrats had no chance. The Democrats had no chance in 2002.
No, I mean in Germany now, of Schröder, because you're right. I only remember only Schröder was against.
Schröder was still supporting Bush in this not even never chance of military support, but of political support. And Schröder in late July, part of the SPD party leadership met in late July in 2002, it wasn't 2002, and Machnik, who's now the minister in Thüringen, SPD minister in Thüringen, with his problem, this scandal of his payments, double payments, something like that. He was at that time the leader. I came to know him in that connection, and he was the leader of the election campaign for Schröder. And he went to Schröder and said, Mr. Chancellor, you have lost the election. Look here, all the opinion poll. However, if you oppose the war, then you may win it. And so Schröder said, okay, and he went to the media and said, things will change. He announced it to the media. The Chancellor does that, political leaders do that. Be prepared, we're going to change our course, so you can know how to write the stories. And so in early August, the whole campaign, and suddenly Schröder was against the war. I have it from American sources in February 1, when Schröder was at the White House, people who were there at the White House, and we gave a talk at the dinner. where he promised Bush he would support him, and in May again when Bush was here. Bush came to Germany not because Germany was against it or something, but because Germany was supporting it. In May they had a similar talk again. And there was American source. As a political scientist, you have to find evidence. Now, if you have American evidence on that, saying that, of course, that will never be credible enough. You have to have German evidence, what I'm just saying. So that's Ambassador Mitzelburg, who was Schröder's foreign policy after Steiner, the ferocious figure who had to go because he was not a very, very elegant person, intellectually smart, but not a very. And so Mitzelburg became then Schröder's foreign policy and security policy advisor in the Chancellery. He was ambassador in one of the Baltic states and was then called into this job. And people from the Stiftung Wissenschaft und Politik, important think tank on foreign international security policy, advising the German government. They have a research group there on EU foreign policy, European foreign policy. And they told me they had at that time, a little bit later, had a meeting with, off the record meeting with Mitzelburg. And Mitzelburg had told them, not for quotation, that Schröder broke off. That's right, supported Bush and then he broke off. However, my reasoning was he wanted to win the election. His reasoning is, however, has a little different reading why that was done. He said Bush had promised Schröder he would consult him. And Schröder felt he was not consulted. The decision was made in Washington about the war without asking him about his advice. He said, okay, if Bush is not loyal to me, I don't have to be loyal to Bush, so I can go wherever I want to. So I can be against the war. So it's a little different reasoning, but the factual description is pretty much the same. Okay, sorry, that was a long response to that, but things could have been differently, yes.
I think you had your hand up.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation. I have two short comments and one question.
Yes.
First of all, I think that Schröder, he had the election in mind, of course, but I also think that the Iraq war was very different to the Afghanistan war, because the Afghanistan war, there was a connection to 9/11.
Yeah.
And Saddam Hussein had obviously no connection at all to 9/11. So I think there's a little bit of difference there. The other comment was, or is that there are several studies from military historians that argue that in the Second World War, the rate of soldiers who couldn't shoot was dramatically different in the European and in the Pacific theater.
Mm-hmm.
So to speak that American soldiers or Australian or British soldiers were more likely to shoot like other different looking people than European people. And I will want to use that statement as for my question. How important is otherness, in your opinion, for American wars in general and for 9/11 or the Iraq war in particular? What difference did it make that terrorists from Arabian countries bombed the World Trade Center and not some Russian terrorists?
Well, I mean, the obvious difference is we have completely forgotten the United States near to the bombing of the federal building in Denver, Colorado, was by American bombing terrorists. And that shock didn't leave an impact on American society. It was terrible. 160 people, I guess 150 people got killed. So that's an important question. I think what you said about differentiation, American soldiers was easier to shoot in the Pacific War than in the European War. Was probably the war against Japan had racist in the language overtones and so on. I'm not a specialist on having never investigated, but by colloquial talking to American and so forth, I know American soldiers, two of them personally who were in that war, described how they were never made prisoners. Terrible stories, I'm going to repeat them here. And so that's probably have to differentiate that. That's an important thing. It's probably also important that they came from Arab background, yes, and especially still today, the debate to this day, in connection with the NSA scandal, that they came from Hamburg. That is issues constantly raised by Americans. They came from your territory, so you didn't provide security enough there or something. About Iraq had nothing to do with that. I would like to make a little remark about that, because it's so important and emotional. It was alluded by the Bush administration in Europe and in the United States, and most Americans believed, as I mentioned before, that Saddam Hussein was involved, was supported the attackers on 9/11. It was afterwards. There was a commission was built by investigative commission by the Senate and by the House to find out what really was happening and what did happen. It was a thick thing. I read parts of it. It's impossible to read all the stuff, so much in it. And anybody who had a good reputation in the United States in foreign security policy was part of that on that commission. And they went into the details about it. Is there anything to it? What the Bush administration, alluded to, made public or something, said he's involved and so forth. We can trust him and so forth. And they came up with the following interesting. That's nobody ever challenged that as non-factual. They came up. It's a bipartisan commission, of course. In 1997, Osama bin Laden met with a representative of Saddam Hussein. The famous, I think probably well known, but it's well worthwhile repeating it. They discussed whether what Saddam Hussein should do. That he was at that time not in Kenya, in one of the East African countries, not Sudan either. Okay, it doesn't matter. They had to find a new home. And so Saddam Hussein, through his emissary, invited him to come to Iraq and to be there. And Saddam Hussein reportedly said, no, thank you. He couldn't trust Saddam Hussein because he was not a religious person, put it that way. And so he went to Afghanistan. So that fact was known in the Bush administration, and some people made a decision about Iraq and Saddam Hussein. And it's interesting here, the neoliberalist school, the Bush administration was full of neoliberals, said, look, these people could not come together that moment because of ideologies, religious beliefs and so forth. They couldn't come together. But they talked. Without success, however, who knows, maybe in the future they come together. That's realistic thinking. That's a classical, realistic interpretation of such an event. And so the Bush people said, look how dangerous he is. Whereas a neoliberal person, a neoliberal theorizing international relations says, see, they have really different values. They will never get together, so we don't have to worry about it. So that's interesting little, for us political scientists or cultural affairs people and so on, to look at it, yeah.
Rumsfeld also talked to
Well, that's the thing about prevention.
But that's an interesting example how to explain when I'm teaching a seminar on international relations and we come to the theory question. That's a good example to illustrate how important theoretical thinking and interpretation is, because then you derive certain recommendation for action from that or not, wherever you are there in your framework. Okay, sorry.
I think Martin Becker had did you have another comment?
Just because somehow we touched on it, I think in Timo's commentary, I was wondering what you thought of the media coverage, because I thought especially you were kind of relativizing Schröder's position or Germany's position towards the Iraq war, but I felt especially that the media coverage was completely different. Like in Germany or in Europe, I think before the Iraq war, there was one article and commentary after the other that Saddam Hussein probably didn't have weapons of mass destruction, while in the United States it struck me that there was a completely different coverage.
The media is one sad story, but media coverage is the New York Times. New York Times was somehow taken in by Bush advisors and so on. They reported as if he was probably most likely to have weapons of mass destruction. And they later apologized for that. They wanted to make up for that again. And it did change their course then. It was embarrassing for them when they discovered that one of the journalists, why he was reporting the way he was reporting and so forth. Yes, however, not to make a complete answer, but give you a little bit answer how I observed, and I never come today to the conclusion why I had a certain phone call, how to explain that. day before the attack on Iraq occurred, I had a telephone conversation with somebody from the Library of Congress, this Congressional Research Service in the Library of Congress, CRS. There's some very important, smart people are there who are advising, working for Congress, like the Wissenschaftliche Dienst des Bundestags, but it's much more important and more visible. They're talking to senators and so on certain issues when they ask them, what should I think of Germany? So, one of those people goes there to a senator and tells them what they think what German foreign policy course is or something. Okay, one of those guys on specialty on terrorism and weapons of mass destruction with an open telephone. Nothing anybody could have listened into as a telephone conversation if they wanted to. Told me nobody here in the Library of Congress I know of thinks that Saddam Hussein has any weapons of mass destruction. So there was apparently among some people widespread knowledge that was nonsense. So I never have really still. I can tell you this telephone call, but I never really got it really, how to interpret it, what to make of it really, and why he talked to me about it on the telephone overseas, an open, unprotected telephone really. So okay. There must have been much more internal dissent than we all still know about it. And it was not really that everybody in Washington really believed the whole story. One little correction of that is, one fine point is, the United Nations was able to destroy, Saddam Hussein did have weapons of mass destruction. And they were also mostly destroyed after the armistice of 1992, 1993. And however, the United Nations arms control specialists who had destroyed most of the weapons of mass destruction he had were surprised to find out how far ahead he was with his nuclear weapons program. They hadn't expected that. That was for all the security people and the CIA people was a big embarrassment. They didn't know about it. And so that's the reason probably came this overreaction too. One explanation, when you justify a war, you can use this and so forth. But then they reported 10% of the weapons, of the chemical weapons, they couldn't trace them. They couldn't destroy them. Nobody knows where they are. Nobody knows today where they are.
Syria.
Yeah, perhaps, yeah. So that's, so these 10% he probably had at the time or something like that. But it's not very important, but it's a kind of minor story.
So thank you very much for your answers and comments and for your speech, of course. Maybe we can extend the discussion to the coffee break, which starts now. And I will see you all back for the next panel at 5. Thank you, Manfred Stinnes.